Good evening, and welcome to our Bible study on Job. We are almost finished with Job. We've been through. When I went back and looked at my notes last week, I realized that my first lesson on Job was September 25th of 2019. So we should finish by the end of the month, and that to me is very interesting that we will have spent exactly 1 year working through the book of Job. Last week, if you remember, and if you weren't with us, sort of a little recap. Last week, when we went through chapters 32 and 33, what we saw this guy Elihu come in, and Elihu is a young guy, and we don't really know how long he's been around Job and his friends, but he's been around for a while. He's heard a lot of the conversations that have happened between Job and his friends, and as Job's friends have tried to tell Job where he's wrong and what he can do to make things right, and so on and so forth. Elihu says that he has been sitting back and listening because he's a young guy, because he knows he doesn't have a lot of wisdom. And last week when he introduced himself and we started hearing from him, one of the things that he said that I thought, and it would sort of be a little bit of a foreshadowing of what we're going to hear this week. He said something to the effect of, just because you're old, that doesn't mean that you have wisdom. And so Elihu is this young guy, and he comes into the picture, and he starts talking to Job, but he starts off being relatively compassionate towards Job. And he tells Job that he wants to justify him and that he wants to see him restored, and so that's kind of sort of what Elihu, kind of how he starts off is he starts off sort of in that kind of in that vein, and so we went through chapters 32 and 33 last week, and so Elihu, he starts off and he talked about how he had been how he had. These words have been kind of fermented, or not, but like the words have been building up in him, and he had gotten to the point to where he just couldn't hold it anymore. And then what he does is he then addresses to Job, and he tries to tell Job, he's of an upright heart, that his lips utter pure knowledge. He says that he wants to be Job's spokesman for God, that he wants to intercede on behalf of Job, and so that's kind of what he does, and so. That chapter 33 is where Job and Elihu kind of again ends with wanting to justify Job and wanting to see him restored, and he sort of connects with Job. Well, in chapter 34, Elihu is going to continue on talking, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight the things through the chapter. I would encourage you to read chapters 34 and 35 on your own. I'm going to give you an overview, one for the sake of brevity, and two, there's a lot in it, but there's a lot of words that kind of describe what Elihu is trying to say that I think we can condense. And so in verses 1 through 4 is where Elihu, this is chapter 34, where Elihu basically, he says, listen to me, let the ear test, the ears test words like the palate tests food. Basically what he's saying is listen to me, listen to the words that I'm saying and see if they're true. And so what Elihu does then is in verses 5 through 9 is he expresses this frustration and really some judgment against Job. And Elihu is going to say things like Job drinks scorn like water, and how he and he talks about how he repeatedly speaks against God. And this isn't particularly fair to Job, because Job has never scorned God. If you remember, as we work through the book, now Job expressed some hurt, Job expressed some frustration, Job expressed a lot of things, but Job never really spoke directly against God so much as he was sort of expressing what he felt like God was doing to him. And it was things like, I wish, Job says at one point that he wished that he had never been born, and couldn't figure. And this is very early in Job. Couldn't figure out why they didn't let him die as a baby. And how. And he would say things later like God was setting traps for him, and God was leading him into snares, and God was shooting him with arrows. And again, none of this indicates that Job was particularly directing scorn at God or speaking against God so much as just kind of speaking from this place of hurt. But as we've seen over the last several chapters, Job's faith has begun to develop at this point. And Job has begun to understand that on the other side of this, he's going to be better. He said that several chapters earlier. He said, I know that on the other side of this, I'm going to be like gold. I'm going to be refined. And so Job, and Job even, again, in one of the earlier chapters, it may have been around chapter 30, may have been around chapter 27, it's several chapters ago. But Job even went so far as to say that, that even if God kills me, that though he may slay me, I still will trust him. And so Job's faith has matured and has developed through this. And then what Elihu does is Elihu comes right back, and Elihu says that Job has scorned God, and that Job is drinking scorn like water, and Job is doing all of these things that Job isn't doing. And then what he does is he misquotes Job. And I want to read in chapter 34 where he does this. And so he says, verse 9, he says, "For he has said, it profits a man nothing that he should delight in God." And Job never said this. Job said things like, like his righteousness was of no benefit to him here, and how he was being punished in spite of his righteousness. But Job never used the phrase that it profits man nothing that he should delight in God. And again, and we've begun to see Job actually live out his faith in this way. And so Elihu, he's kind of gotten in that rhythm now, and he's talking, and now his words are not they're not doing any real particular good. So he's accused Job of wrongdoing. He's misquoting Job at this point. And then verses 10 through 30 of chapter 34 there's a lot in that. And in the first few verses, in verses 10 through 15, what Elihu says is basically that God is totally just, that he does good, that he's in complete control. He even goes so far as to say, when talking about God's power, he said, verse 14 and 15, "If he should set his heart on it, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust." And so he's talking about God's power and God's might. And what we're going to see with Elihu is, as much as he's right about God, he's wrong about Job. And so all of this talk about wanting to be Job's spokesman and wanting to see Job justified and wanting to intercede for Job he's going to not really live this out. And so in this way, we're going to see Elihu a lot like Job's friends. And so in verses 10 through 15, he says things like, he says, "For he repays man according to his work and makes a man to find reward according to his way." He says, "Surely God will never do wickedly, nor will the Almighty pervert justice." And so Elihu is trying to communicate to Job that God is good and everything that God does is good. And we know this, and a lot of times we know this intellectually, but we don't really know it emotionally. It doesn't really connect. Like in my mind, I know that everything that God does is good. I know that everything that God does is just good in its truest sense. God is the ultimate. God is good. Like that. That's his ultimate characteristic, is that he is good. But when I'm in the midst of trial, it's hard for me to remember that. And so emotionally, a lot of times I don't remember that. And I know it, but I don't feel like it. And so Elihu is trying to remind Job of this. And then in verses 16 through 20, again, I'm not going to read it all to you, and he keeps saying things like, "If you have understanding, hear this. If you have ears, listen to this." And really what he's saying here is if you're interested in knowing the truth, listen to what I'm saying. That's kind of what Elihu is saying here. And so he verses 16 through 20, what he does is he continues on in this chain of thought, or this train of thought, I'm sorry. And he says, if you have understanding, hear this. Listen to the sound of my words. And then he goes in and he said, should one who hates justice govern, and will you condemn him who is most just? And what he's saying here, what he's asking Job, and he's kind of turned a little bit and talking to Job's friends, is who are you to question God? And it's very easy for us to say that when we're not in the midst of this. Now there's truth to that. Who are we to question God? We're nobody to question God. We're God's creation. We're created, and our lives are for God's glory. And so to a degree, Elihu was right. Who are we to question God? Who are you? If God was bad, would he be God? And that's really what he's asking here when he says this. He says, should one who hates justice govern, and will you condemn him who is most just? And so he's saying God is God because God is good. And if God were not good, he wouldn't be God. And so there's a deep sort of theological, philosophical argument there. But then he goes in verse 19, yet he is not partial to princes, nor does he regard the rich more than the poor, for they are all the work of his hands. And then he goes on and he basically says, we're all going to die. We're temporal creatures. We're here for a very short period of time. We're unrighteous. God is righteous. Who are we to even question what God does? And again, there's complete truth to this. But the question is, as I'm reading this, is this something that really that we should be saying to Job right now? Maybe this is what Job needs. I'm not sure that this is what Job needs, but again, Elihu is not really in that way, is not really talking, saying anything that's necessarily wrong. And then in verses 21 through 30, he goes on in sort of this monologue. And he says, for his eyes are on the ways of man, and he sees all his steps. There is no darkness nor shadow of death where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves. And he says that God sees everything, and God knows everything. And God, nothing escapes God's view, and nothing escapes God's oversight. And so what Elihu is indicating here is that Job has got sin because God is good and God wouldn't do wicked. And if Job is saying that something wicked is happening, then it can't be God just arbitrarily dumping on Job, because that would be wicked. And so there's got to be some other reason, because God is good. And we know this from reading the book. We know that there is something else, that this is God allowing these things to happen so that Job can demonstrate his faith, so that to prove that Job is a man of faith, that Job is a righteous man. Now, we don't know this, and Job doesn't know this, and none of these people know this. But Elihu is kind of onto something, in that if something bad is happening, it's not because God is bad, it's because there's something else going on. Now, the logical conclusion is that it's because of Job's sin. And so, and he goes on, and he says, therefore, verse 25, therefore he knows their works, he overthrows them in the night, and they are crushed. He strikes them as wicked men in the open sight of others, because they turn back from him and would not consider any of his ways, so that they cause the cry of the poor to come to him, for he hears the cry of the afflicted. And Elihu is, again, and he's talking about how God does hear us, but there's this implication here that Job needs to change something for God to hear him. And so, verse 29, he says, when he gives quietness, who then can make trouble? And when he hides his face, who then can see him, whether it is against a nation or a man alone, that the hypocrite should not reign, lest the people be ensnared. And so he's saying when God gives peace, then nobody can bother him. Nobody can bother that person. Like God is in control of everything, and God does what God does, and what God does is good. And Job, if there's something wrong, then there's something wrong on your end and not God's end, because God's not bad. And again, he's speaking truth in this way. Now, he's not been speaking the truth to Job, because he misquoted Job, and he's accusing Job of doing wrong. And then we're going to see this again in verses 31 through 33. He says, for as anyone said to God, I have borne chastening, I will offend no more. Teach me what I do not see. If I have done iniquity, I will do no more. And then verse 33, this is very interesting. He said, should he repay it according to your terms, just because you disavow it? You must choose and not I, therefore speak what you know. And what Elihu is saying here is he's saying, look, even if you're saying that you've sinned and that you've done iniquity and that you've transgressed against God, which are things that Job has said. Job never said that he was perfect. And when God said that Job was blameless, he didn't mean that Job was perfect. What he meant was Job's character was upright, that he was of a mature spirit, and his faith was solid. And so what Elihu is saying here is he's saying, even if you confess your sin, it's up to God to do what God does. And God's not going to repay you or do what you want him to do just because you've confessed your sins to him. And it's almost like what Elihu is saying here is he's not really implying that Job's confession is insincere, but what he's saying is that, yeah, Job, you've said that you've sinned, and you've said that you're not perfect, but who are you to say what should happen? Who are you to determine what punishment you should get? And really, this goes down to the question of what do we think is fair? You know, how do we view fairness and how do we view punishment versus what does God see as fair and what does God see as just? And I think again, Elihu is not wrong here in this. I don't think it's not really my place if I sin to go to God and say, God, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done this, but here's how I'd like to be punished. That would be no different from our kids saying, hey, I did X, Y, and Z wrong, but instead of a spanking, how about just, I don't know, maybe a few minutes off my tablet or whatever. And that's kind of what Elihu is sort of, I think that's what he thinks Job is doing, is that as Job has confessed his sins and as Job has acknowledged where he has done wrong, he thinks that Job is really saying, God, I've done things wrong, but the way that you're punishing me is too much, it's too harsh, and I don't deserve this. When Elihu is saying, God's God, and if God is punishing you like this, then it's because you deserved it, and it's because God thought it was the right thing, because it is not thought, but because it is the right thing to do. And again, outside of this conversation between God and Satan, where Satan has been roaming the earth, and God says, have you considered my servant Job? Apart from that, a lot of what Elihu is saying here would probably be true. However, there's this massive part of the story that he doesn't know, and Job doesn't even know it, and nobody knows it. And so they're all, again, and they've been doing this the whole book, just kind of talking past each other. And what I think may be frustrating, at least it's frustrating for me, is to see how Elihu started off as wanting to help Job, and now he's really begun condemning him, and it's going to get worse. And verses 34 through 37, we'll read this and then we'll be done with this chapter. He says, men of understanding say to me, wise men who listen to me, Job speaks without knowledge, his words are without wisdom. Oh, that Job were tried to the utmost, because his answers are like those of wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin, he claps his hands among us, and multiplies his words against God. And that phrase, he claps his hands among us, that was an insult. That was the way that they would insult one another. If somebody was talking, they would clap at them. You might have seen this. It's become a thing again. When they call it really now a clap back. Where somebody would say something, you go, oh, good job, way to go, and this very snarky, sarcastic thing. And what's funny is, like the writer of Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun. Even the clapback is nothing new. That's been going on for thousands of years. Sorry, Zennials and Gen, wherever we are now. But yeah, and so what he says is he says Job, his answers are like those of wicked men. He adds rebellion to his sin. Not only has he sinned, but he's also rebelling against God, and he's speaking against God. And he says he claps his hands among us. He treats us with disdain. When we try to get together to help him, he claps his hands at us, and he tries to drown us out, and he tries to show us how good he is, and he disregards everything that we're saying. Not only that, but he multiplies his words against God. And it's almost like he's shifted from maybe sympathetic, maybe wanting to help Job, to now trying to maybe rile the crowd up around Job against him. And so, you can almost hear his tone picking up as he says these things. Then in verse 35, and we're going to be done. We're going to be done with this in just a minute, because 35 is relatively short. And then in chapter 35. And then chapter 35 starts off, moreover, Elihu answered and said, do you think this is right? Do you say, my righteousness is more than God's? For you say, what advantage will it be to you? What profit shall I have more than if I had sinned? And so what he does is he's sort of given this rousing speech, and then he kind of turns back over to Job, and he goes, what say you, Job? Do you think this is right? Do you hear what I'm saying? Where am I wrong? And he says, are you saying that your righteousness is more than God's? Are you saying, and this is really where Elihu is becoming very confrontational, is he's looking at Job and he's saying, are you saying that God is wrong, and the only way that you can say that God is wrong is if you're more righteous than God? So is your righteousness more than God's? And he's trying to trip Job up here, and he's trying to hem him up, and he's really trying to get the point across that he's right and Job is wrong. And he says, for you say, what advantage will it be to you? What profit shall I have more than if I had sinned? And what he's saying, he's quoting Job as if Job is talking to God. And again, he's misquoting Job, and he's sort of ascribing something to Job that Job didn't say. Job has said many times that his righteousness hasn't helped him in the situation. That even though he's righteous, even though he hasn't sinned to the point to where he deserves what's happened, these things have happened anyway. But Job has never indicated that his righteousness was useless or his righteousness was wasted. And that's kind of what Elihu these are the words that Elihu's putting in Job's mouth, is really, he's saying that Job kind of looks up to God and says, what's the point in being righteous? I wouldn't be any more righteous now I'm not doing any better now righteous than what I would have done if I just lived in sin. Job has never gone in that direction. Job has never said that righteousness was wasted or that he's wasted his time being righteous. But Job has made statements to the effect of, this righteousness hasn't kept me out of this trouble. It hasn't kept this stuff from happening to me. And I think a lot of times we find ourselves in that same situation. We're going, and even the psalmist, and one of the Psalms, for some reason I've got 73 in my mind. I may be wrong on that. But David writes, I look around and I see everybody else flourishing and being blessed and getting rich, and I see the wicked getting fat from food, and I see all of these people, and they're doing all of these terrible things, and they're taken care of, and yet I'm the one that life is dumping on, and I'm the one that's having a hard time, and I'm the one that's struggling, and I'm on the run from people who are trying to kill me, and all of these things. And David wrestled with this a long time after Elihu and Job dealt with this issue, was how do we reconcile when I'm trying to live right and bad things are happening, and people who are completely disregarding God, or good things are happening to them. And that's that age-old question, nothing new under the sun. And so Elihu, starting in verse 4, he says, I'll answer you and your companions with you. Look to the heavens and see, and behold the clouds, they are higher than you. And then he says, if you sin, what do you accomplish against him? Or if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? And so what he's saying here is he's saying God is so far above you, Job, that if you sin, what is it hurting God? And it's not really so much, I think, sin as it is Job's challenge to God. When Job says, God, what are you doing? How is this fair? Why is this happening? And Job's going, it's not fair, whatever. Elihu is saying, what does that matter to God? Like, you're a person. Like, God is so much higher than you. Creation is higher than you. He says, if you sin, what do you accomplish against him? Or if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? Your sin doesn't affect God. It does affect God in that it hurts God and that sin angers God. But as far as affecting God where he is, our sin doesn't. Our sin, really what he's saying here is our sin affects us. And he says, if you're righteous, what do you give him? Or what does he receive from your hand? So if you sin, what does it do to God? If how does your righteousness benefit God? And he again, and Elihu is sort of reminding Job that God is here and Job is here, and God is the one that's in control and has the authority and has the might and everything, and so that again, that's kind of the direction that he's going. He says, if you're righteous, what do you give him, or what does he receive from your hand? And then he says, your wickedness affects a man such as you, and your righteousness a son of man. Whether you're wicked or righteous, God is God. God's going to be the same. God's not going to change. God's always going to be in control. If you sin, you're the one that's going to be hurt, and if you're righteous, you're the one that's going to benefit from it. There's a gap between you and there's a space between you and God, and there is a space between us and God. To make things super theological now, there is a space between us and God, and Jesus is that bridge. Jesus is the one that fills that space between us and God, and so we know that now. That's not the point Elihu is making. And I do want to read verses 9 through 16, and then we're going to be done. He says, because of the multitude of oppressions they cry out, They cry out for help because of the arm of the mighty, but no one says, where is God my maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth, and makes us wiser than the birds of heaven? And he says, because of oppression, people cry out to God. They cry out to help. That people know who God is, and they know that God is there. But he says, no one says, where is God? And what he's saying here is he's trying to kind of isolate Job, and he's trying to make Job feel like he's the only one that says, where's God? Because Elihu's basically saying nobody else says that. Everybody else is going through troubles and tribulations, and nobody else is saying, where's God my maker? Who gives songs in the night, teaches us more than beasts of the earth, and makes us wiser than the birds of heaven. He says that, and then he says, because they cry out, he does not answer because of the pride of evil men. And he says, surely God will not listen to empty talk, nor will the Almighty regard it. Although you say you do not see him, yet justice is before him, and you must wait for him. And now, because he has not punished in his anger, nor taken much notice of folly. And then verse 16, therefore Job opens his mouth in vain. He multiplies words without knowledge. And what he's saying here is he's saying, these multitudes of people cry out, but if God doesn't answer, it's because of their pride. It's because they've got sin. It's because they're not really trusting in God. If they're crying out, he doesn't answer. And again, and this is Elihu really going after Job and really trying to convict Job here. And so, and we'll end it with verse 16 again, and he sort of reiterates his indictment against Job, that Job opens his mouth in vain, and he multiplies words without knowledge. And so, again, Elihu, probably not the greatest friend. And as I end this thing, one of the things that I noticed and that really stuck out to me was I can imagine, and this is pure speculation, and I get that, but I can imagine that Elihu probably hurt Job more than the other friends. And the reason I think that is because Elihu started off sounding like a friend. Elihu started off sounding like somebody who wanted to help Job. And then what happened was he began to condemn him, and he began to indict him, and he began to impugn him. And over and over and over, he just goes after Job again and again and again. And where we started off thinking maybe he was going to do okay, he ended up really being worse than the other friends, because at least the other friends started off saying, hey, you're wrong, you need to get right. Elihu, on the other hand, was not nearly as honest at the beginning with Job. And so now Elihu has found himself condemning Job along with his friends. And so, with all that being said, we are done with chapters 34 and 35 of Job. Next week, we're going to tackle a couple of more chapters, and then here in just a couple of weeks, we're going to hear from God. And then Job is going to come back in a little bit, and then we'll be done with Job. So got just a couple more weeks, and then we'll be done. So again, as we finish up Job, if there's another book of the Bible that you'd like for us to go through on Wednesdays as sort of that verse by verse inductive Bible study, feel free to leave a comment, send me a DM, shoot me a text, see me at church on Sunday and say, look, I'd really like to tackle this book or whatever. I'm interested in what you guys want to go through. So let me know what book you want to do, and we'll get that going. And otherwise, you guys have a great rest of the week, and we will hopefully see you here Sunday morning for worship as we continue in our study through the Gospel of Mark. So you'll have a great week. See you Sunday.